with a huge, hearty Washington welcome. David Fowler, thank you for being here. Kick it off, buddy.
It's interesting that we are so grateful, humbly grateful, Gabriel and I, my partner in Embrace Fully, that you have sort of adopted us and are willing to work with us. We are 3 years old. In that 3 years, we had no clue that we were going to be where we are today, serving 20 states. It grew so fast. I kind of think of it in a way, it was sort of like being on the rump of a galloping horse, without any control over the reins, which is kind of how God works. You're just sitting there going where it's going. You're not directing. I mean, we thought at first we were going to kind of direct this thing. We had some specific ideas for it. But every single individual that comes out of a prison is a different case. They all have different needs. And to meet those needs, we had to be extraordinarily flexible. And now we find ourselves training, which we didn't ever think we'd have to do. We just thought volunteers would come to, want to work with people. But we had no idea what we were doing. I mean, we're kind of like just dumb kids in a way. But we've sort of just found our way along, listening to things, listening, and being willing. So anyway, here we are today. We're, like I said, we are very, very blessed and very grateful and very humble to be working with you. So let's do work together closely. We have a lot of ideas. You talked about ideas, Trinka. So yeah, we'd like to jump into this with you. So I have a little slideshow. I should mention too that Embrace Fully started out of a necessity. When I was doing interviews for Light in Prison, we would do these interviews with these chaplains who were great chaplains, just like people here are great chaplains. And they would have these wonderful stories of people. And then we started hearing these other stories where people would be studying Christian Science for years in some cases and would be released, and there was no one to meet them. There was no organization out there to, in California at this time, there was nobody out there, to welcome them, to give them housing. That's now changed. Or services. You could find them, but it was very, very difficult for anybody coming out of prison after 20, 30, 40 years in some cases. Everything is different. I mean, everything is different. And they look at a cell phone and it's like, they're not sure what end is up, what is that thing again? And I'm supposed to talk into it. And people, they have no clue about what the world has become. Streets are different, buildings are different, cars are certainly different. The way we talk is different. So there was no one out there to guide folks, when they came through the process of being released and going back into the communities. We even noticed that there were a number of churches that wouldn't accept people because they had tattoos, long straggly hair, didn't look like us, don't sound like us. Therefore, there were even some churches that actually rejected people that had come out of prison. And when we sort of learned about what was going on, we just said, somebody has to jump into this space because nobody's there. And it's not that we're so great. It's just that we just said, we just have to do this. And my partner, Gabriel, and I had been working, with Light in Prison. So it was a natural partnership. So all of that said, basically for the people that are ministering, and that's you, the questions are, how do you aid an inmate's moral transformation? And I say moral rather than spiritual. Moral is really, that's our playground. That's where we're at with people in prison. We're not talking about highfalutin metaphysics. We're talking about deeply ingrained, immoral, things that people have grown up with that really have to be overcome. And that is hard work. That's not an easy job. When you look at Jesus, I mean, what was he doing? It was all about transformation. I mean, everything that he did was all about transformation, to the point that you could then start to envision the kingdom of heaven. And that was a lot of work, obviously. And also we're going to talk about where do you find the evidence of an inmate's transformation? So kind of big questions. These are things that we're still working with. We don't have the answers. I didn't come here bringing a whole pile of answers for you, but I do have a love for this whole idea of transformation. My life was is a story of transformation, you know, and I looked up transformation in the 1820 dictionary that Mrs. Eddy used by Noah Webster. It's a wonderful dictionary if you haven't already seen it, and I'm sure you have. But his definition of transformation was a change in heart in man by which his disposition and temper are conformed to the divine image. That's a beautiful definition. Absolutely stunning definition, I think. And then what we've seen in our work is that, like in my own case, transformation came about very, very quickly. And that's because I was about 5 seconds away from being buried, being laid into the ground. I had overdosed, and I'm laying in my backyard at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I had a choice. You can go into that grave right there, or you can change. And something inside of me said, I cannot be the same old me. I will not be the same old me. And I meant it 150%. I had no idea that was a prayer. I wasn't a Christian Scientist. I was a drug addict. I had no idea I was praying. But once I made that absolute commitment that I would rather die than continue to live the old life that I had lived, once I did that, it was the most amazing thing happened. I got surrounded with this amazing sense of peace. It was like somebody just had enveloped me in peace. And I didn't know where it came from. I didn't know who sent it. But there it was, and I was like in it. And it was the most amazing thing, because from that, I was basically healed of not just a drug addiction, but heart problems. I was a meth addict. So if anybody knows anything about methadone, it's one of those things that just sort of tears up all the organs on the inside. I had 2 doctors tell me that I was literally going to die within 2 weeks. So in order to head off that at the pass, I thought, okay, I'll just take my own life. And so that's kind of how I ended up in my backyard at 3 o'clock in the morning. And that's where I finally met God face to face, if you will, because it was very much a extremely tangible. So when I say there's, it can happen quickly, it can, but mostly what you probably are facing is individuals where transformation comes about incrementally. And it's when the immoral traits become self-evident to someone over time, and more disgusted, and they cannot tolerate their life or that particular quality in their life any longer. And that's when they're willing to give it up. There has to be a certain kind of Mrs. Eddy talks about, hell as self-imposed agony. That's kind of what you're looking for. Somebody who's in that particular hell, self-imposed agony, where they realize that this isn't the system that did this to me. I did this to me. When somebody finally, gets to that point, that's what I think when you have a chance. That's really where you're there, you have a chance. And you can help aid them getting to that point too. And we'll talk a little bit about that. One of the things that we see that now that we have these angel teams all over the country is that angel teams are the downstream from the chaplain's work on the inside of the prison. Angel teams are the downstream. They're going to get the product that comes out of that prison. So if that individual has had a significant moral transformation, it's amazing how the lights go green in their life. Things just seem to open up. Jobs seem to appear out of nowhere. And we have people that you may have seen if you've been into, if you've looked at our website. We've had people that have had these amazing transformations in prison. And one of the things that they say, and this is one of the things you can identify, is when somebody is finally, they say, I'm free, even though I'm locked up. If somebody's not free, you have a little bit of work to do. And that is our work, is to free that individual, help free that individual, or aid them in finding their own freedom. So there's those individuals that come out, and those are a piece of cake. Those are the people that putting an angel team together, this is a dream. This is so simple. This is so easy for us. Because really what we're then doing is we're mentoring and coaching. We're bringing you back from 30 years outside the world, in outer space somewhere called a prison. We're bringing you back to Earth. And this is what Earth is like. And this is what streets are like. And this is transportation. Helping those people is really a dream because they want to learn. They do learn. They're fast to learn. They don't wait. And that's been another thing that we've kind of seen in people is that when they come out and they're hesitant, it's usually because they haven't had a significant or very thorough moral transformation. We had a guy, and I'll just tell you about this. This is kind of a heartbreaker, but this was a guy that was in prison for 50 years. When he came out just 2 years ago, he had been through, the chaplain told us that she worked with this guy every week for something like 15 years after he found Christian Science in prison. And he loved it. He gravitated to it. He told his friends about it. He brought people to services. He was like the leader of the group in the prison. He was just so into it. He could quote. He read Science and Health backwards and forwards. He knew everything about it. But yet, when he came out, he was really in this situation where, he failed. And you had to go, well, what was it that failed there? And I was just thinking about this morning, and I wrote down, this is what happened to this guy. He was using Christian Science to cover his sins rather than to unmask them. And that's our job. So he's come back to us after he had a very serious illness. And after sort of leaving, the Embrace Fully fold, if you will, he went off on his own. And it's because he really didn't really want to, conform his thinking to what God wanted him to do. There was no real basis. In other words, there was no moral transformation on which to base his thoughts coming out. So now he's in touch with us again. So we have another chance. We have another chance. This is not necessarily where we want to be reaching people. We want to reach them. You want to take note of this. We want to reach people in the pre-parole phase, not in the pre-release phase. Pre-release mindset is totally, totally different than somebody who has been granted the parole date or pre-parole. They're in the pre-parole phase. They have yet to come before a parole board, that is, and have a parole board give them a parole date. Those people, they're open. Their hearts tend to bleed. They're the ones that may think they may never ever get parole and may never see the street again, may never see a family. So we want to reach people in the pre-parole phase. Pre-release, it's a lot harder work actually, because their mindset is already on, okay, I'm going to get out. I might be nervous. I might be anxious about a lot of stuff, but I got a date. I'm going to get out. And that can be more work for our angel teams. That's anyway what we're finding. So to get a clear idea of transformation, we're just going to discuss a couple of things here, and that is how one's heart can open wider and how that can produce a transformation. I'm talking about how your heart opens wider and that can produce transformation in you, which then can produce transformation in others. You're sort of the spark plug here. And number two is how divine love working in our consciousness can aid an inmate's transformation. So those are kind of the two things that I'm going to talk about. And I've been given a kind of a small window here, so I'll try to get through this without violating what I've been told to do. You may be familiar with this guy. He had something amazing happen to him in the book which was a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, please, it's How the Grinch Stole Christmas. I love the Jim Carrey version. I don't know if you ever saw that one in 2007. He was so good. He was so evil, which made him so good because he really played that part so perfectly, So does anybody know what happened when the Grinch found out that it wasn't all about presents, that Christmas was about something else? Certainly, his heart grew 3 times the size that it was. And that's a beautiful illustration for our work, because that's essentially what we're into. We're into the heart, growing business here. From that, this is what came to me when I was thinking about that. When I thought about the Jim Carrey or even the book, it's divine love flows to you in order to flow through you. So if you think in any which way that divine love just sort of ends up in you, then you're probably not feeling it, because it's really felt as it passes through and radiates out of us. My teacher used to talk a lot about love radiates. I always loved that. It's not something you dispense personally. It radiates through you. And I just think that's such a beautiful way of thinking of love. And that, to me, love comes to us to go through us back to God. So there's this wonderful cycle that's happening and occurring. So that's kind of what the whole idea here of transformation is really based on. And if you haven't found this one here, this quote that it's at the bottom here, intrepid, self-oblivious love. I just love that, self-oblivious love. What a great thing to attain. So let's see here. I have a little short story, and it has to do with me. And this is at a time. This is going to sound odd coming from a Christian Scientist at this point, because this story occurred while I was a drug addict. And this is important because you're going to be working with a lot of people that were drug addicts in prison, alcoholics in prison, who may not really be over that, even though they're just being, kind of kept on ice maybe. But like I said, I was addicted to hard drugs, and any drug was a good enough drug, but I was especially addicted to crystal meth. One day, I'm sitting on my porch. I was also a drug dealer, which I haven't told too many people. This isn't going live anywhere, is it? No. Anyway, I'm sitting on my porch on this warm spring day, and this dog walks into my yard. He's a beautiful looking dog. This isn't actually him, but it's sort of like him. And he sat there and he just stared at me for, I don't know, the longest time. It was like, wow, who can blink first? And he just stayed there, and he just seemed to have this calmness about being okay about being in my yard. Obviously, he didn't know anything about my background. He didn't know anything that, the life I was living. But I sort of think of him a little bit as like an angel. So he comes into my yard, and every day he kept coming back, and every day he would stay a little bit longer. Finally, the equation sort of goes like this, stray dog comes into your yard, and I go, okay, I'll get him some water. I got him some water. He liked that. And the next day I put some food out. No, he liked that. And next thing I know, Arnold, as which I called him, has found a new home. And boy, did he find himself at home. I would let him go anywhere and do anything he wanted to do, but he couldn't get on my bed. That was a no-no. For some reason, he liked me, and I wasn't sure what it was, because I didn't like people like the Grinch. I was not a nice person. I had what you would call a really icy, cold heart. The people I sold the drugs to, I didn't care if they died or not. I mean, I cared that they wouldn't give me money, but I didn't really have any, heart for the people. But Arnold, on the other hand, was slowly but surely melting my little icy cold heart, which was very small. And there was a few months where we had just been doing everything together and having a lot of fun, actually. And that was odd for me, because I didn't really know what fun was. Having somebody else in my life was unique and new. And then one day, Arnold stopped eating and he stopped drinking. And I noticed that his nose and inside of his mouth were dry. And I touched his nose, and it was just like a piece of rubber. It had no wet to it at all, like it normally did. And I didn't know what to make of it. And this is just how out of it, a drug addict can be. Like, oh, okay, well, he's just not eating or drinking. Oh, okay, I'll see him tomorrow. And this went on for about a week. And finally, one of my drug customers comes by the house, and he looks at Arnold, and he said, that dog needs help. He really needs help, and you need to get him to a vet. And so I thought, a vet. Okay, well, I had plenty of money because I was a drug dealer. But okay, I have no problem. So I bundled him up, and I took him to the vet. And the vet, after 20 minutes, came back out, and he just looked at me and he just said, shaking his head, said, sorry, he's not going to make it. You'll be lucky if he gets through the night. And I was crushed. So I took him home and I laid him in my bed, which is a no-no. That's just how much it affected me. And I prayed, but mostly my praying at that point was, at first I didn't even know if there was really a God, where there was a God, if there was a God, how God operated, if there was a God. But I started to pray just in case, which is probably what a lot of people in prison do. Just in case there's a God, I'll say some words. And that's what I was doing at first. I was saying some words. And the more I said the words, the heart, the more I felt the words. And even if there wasn't a God, I was feeling something. And this is what I would think of what was happening if I could draw this up. It's what I call a morality meter. And this is mine before Arnold, and this is what it would have looked like. Now, in Science and Health, that on pages 115 and 116, we have, these are the three different, the translation of mortal mind. And at the very bottom there in the black area is what she calls depravity. And how she describes that is probably where most people in prison are. They don't think of it as being a depraved state because it seems normal. I grew up this way. This is my life. Why are you questioning this? This is me. I get along by hurting other people first. And I get along by having eyes in the back of my head. I know what people are doing. In prison, I know who's going to attack me, who can attack me, who to look at, who not to look at. All of that is a depraved state. And mostly prisons are, in a sense, that state that Mrs. Eddy defines. Now, our work is in that middle area, really, where is evil beliefs disappearing. That's our work. It's wonderful work. So, but anyway, if you can see that little dot in the bottom there, that's kind of where I'd indicated where I was, probably. That's the condition of my heart when I met Arnold. And that night, I prayed literally for hours. I found something here in miscellaneous writings where Mrs. Eddy says that God, helps us most when help is most needed. And I have to tell you, that was so true for me. Help was so needed. And that's what I was praying about. I needed God's help. And I just kept praying and begging and praying and begging. And finally, I just felt like, I had cried out everything I could cry out. I didn't have anything left. But suddenly, and this was very interesting, I felt that same reassuring sense of peace, which I then felt a few years later after I had my own drug healing. But I felt a sense of peace. I couldn't describe it. I didn't know what it was. I thought I was at peace because I was just tired. And I didn't know what it was, but it felt good. It had a certain upbeat to it. And I felt, in a way, kind of like, I don't know, hopeful. And that was unusual because hope, when in the face of a very good vet saying there's no hope and don't hope and he's gonna die. But anyway, this piece reversed that. This is how my morality meter changed. It went up a step. So, like the Grinch, my heart grew, and it was God that grew it. I didn't know that, but that's what had happened. I didn't wake up in the next morning in a normal way. When I was awakened by a very rude, wet tongue licking my face. He was not only alive, he was super alive. And he was hopping around the house like a bunny. I mean, literally just hopping. He was like, and I had water for him and food, which is all gone. I had to go put more food in several times. But Arnold was a brand new dog, and he lived for many, many years. But But that's how one transformation can affect another's transformation. And when I think about how that healing occurred, consciousness, your consciousness, my consciousness, isn't separate from its mental contents. The contents that are in our consciousness, it is our consciousness. It's not out there. There's no consciousness out there. Mrs. Eddy talks about being subjective consciousness. So this isn't brand new stuff. It's new. I mean, Mrs. Eddy was really one of the very first to really understand consciousness. But this is our field. This is our expertise, is consciousness. Right now in the world of quantum physics, consciousness is the big, all-absorbing question. Nobody knows what it is. They know we have it, but they don't know what it is. Nobody has defined it. Nobody can describe it. Now, of course, they're looking at consciousness, their own consciousness, and they're going, how do I describe all the stuff that's in it? How did it get there? How does my thought affect it? Because now we realize, wow, if it's consciousness, thought is definitely affecting physical things, which is what quantum physics has figured out and tested and proved. We're not the only ones in this field. We're just the ones in this field that actually understand something about God enlightened consciousness. It's totally different than any other human consciousness and the contents that it has. So Arnold, being in my consciousness, received that love and that compassion that God was flowing to me. Arnold was the recipient. So that is basically how this works. It's, sometimes we kind of get concerned how this works. And it's allowing God, opening the door to God. And that's really the work right there, is allowing God in. So how did the Arnold healing occur here? I say it another way here, that the compassion flowing to God, from God to my consciousness, uplifted Arnold's health. So just a few things about consciousness here, how love accepted into consciousness actually has an effect on everything around us. So I just drew this little thing. It's our subjective consciousness has an endless array of indwelling subjects, forms, images, as Mrs. Eddy calls them. I call it conscious inhabitants. Everything in your consciousness is an inhabitant, and in the environment within your consciousness. It's not separate from you, which is how healing works. It doesn't require space. So, and like I said, that quantum physics is really trying to understand this, that their thoughts are literally producing the things they see. There's a great book called it's written by a man that is a quantum physics guy that I had a chance to meet. And he talks about that the world really is consciousness. This is a scientist. I mean, a world-renowned scientist, and Donald Hoffman, and he's written a book that you should read. And I'm trying to think of the name of it, and it will come to me. But anyway, in the book, he does say, we don't know what it is, but it sure does produce a lot of results that we see, and we move in this and we act in this, but we just don't understand it yet. So, but we do to some degree. So some of those subjective images of consciousness appear as prisons, officers, inmates, wardens, and others, the actual buildings themselves. That's in us. That's not out there somewhere you drive to. That's in us. How do we get into them? That's in us. How do we get a bigger effect? That's in us. We're not waiting for somebody to give us a green light. Only God can do that. So who are we relying on? The inhabitants of consciousness to tell us? He can't. That's in our consciousness, if you know what I'm saying. So here we are again with the morality meter. It just really basically goes up and down. What that really means is the up and down movement of our morality meter is really our proximity to divine love. That's really what this indicates. Some years ago, back in the 40s, a very well-known Christian scientist. His name was Paul Stark Seeley. And he had written an article, and it directly discusses this topic. Where do the things come from? How do the things that are in consciousness get healed? You're not healing something outside consciousness. You have direct control in a sense. And that's good news. The article's called Our Without is Our Within. Just the title of the article itself to me is an entire article. I mean, that was kind of Mr. Seeley's ability to encapsulate really, really big ideas in ways that were very understandable. Just thought I would bring this information to you that I found in the Prison Policy Initiative there in Massachusetts. And they sort of track what are going on in prisons throughout the country. And what they've said here is that the state of Washington has an incarceration rate of 455 per 100,000 people, making that it locks up a higher percentage of its people than almost any democracy on earth. You're ahead of California there. That's not good. This is right now. Yes, the state of Washington. This is something we can work on because all of these percentages are in one place, consciousness. I've come to call the idea of prayer now that I've kind of thought about consciousness a little bit more. I call prayer the prayer of dissolving self, because that's essentially what prayer does. And I also made these little illustrations here you're familiar with. Entirely separate from the belief and dream of material living is the life divine. What's going on there? It's revealing spiritual understanding and the consciousness of man's dominion over the whole earth. The beautiful, beautiful statement. Obviously, somebody had to learn that and live that in order to write that. So what exactly does truth dissolve in us? Well, I also created this little, see this little cloud-like thing there. That's sort of what human mind is like, basically. It's a little obstruction, sort of like fog in a way. Sun didn't go anywhere. Sun's still there. Sun's still shooting light out. It's that little fog that is basically that barrier. Well, that's the fault, like what I call the false self or personality. Mrs. Eddy talks a lot about personality, and she doesn't have really good things to say about it. So traits of the false self or the personality are in that little gray area. You got self-justification, deceit, hatred, revenge, and a whole lot of others. Should say this here, that miscellaneous writings. I bypassed this earlier, and I should have said this because it's a really, really important thing. This is in Pond and Purpose, which you're all familiar with. But at the bottom of page 203, she says that the baptism of repentance is indeed a stricken state of human consciousness, wherein mortals gain severe views of themselves, a state of mind which rends the veil that hides mental deformity. That's what you're looking to do, is that's what we're trying to achieve. A lot of times, Christian scientists I've found, are a bit confused on this work because they think that, well, healing of sin is sort of like, it's the same as healing of disease. That's actually not true. And here's what Mrs. Eddy says about that. The only difference between the healing of sin and the healing of sickness is that sin must be uncovered before it can be destroyed, and the moral sense be aroused to reject the sense of error, while sickness must be covered with the veil of harmony. Those are two drastically different things. So in our work, we're dealing in that arena, the uncovering, the unmasking. And in a sense, that's what that's really what our chaplains are now realizing, that the job is about reformation. That's the job. It's nice to go into the prisons and the jails and sing. It's nice to have a service. Those are important things. But are we getting at the root of the issues that people have? Not always necessarily. And I'm not saying that as a criticism, I'm saying that as a learning. I'm just saying we're now receiving people downstream in our angel teams, like I said earlier, who are suffering with those individuals who have not had a complete moral transformation. Our job is to uncover and unmask and do it unflinchingly. Mrs. Eddy did. I mean, would not want to have lived in her home. That woman didn't have 1 ounce of shyness about ripping the mask off. Didn't bother her. Didn't keep her up at night. She was definitely understood that if that deceit in an individual wasn't seen and they didn't see it and they didn't repent and they weren't, through with it, then they weren't going to go anywhere. They were going to stay right at that point until eventually they did do that. And that's what we have to do as chaplains. We can't walk away from people who want to dismiss the conversation that they need to have. They know they need to have this conversation. They got into prison for very, very specific moral reasons. Don't be afraid to unmask. I don't know if I can say that loud enough. In my own life, that's what had to happen. My life had to come to an end. And it did. So back to our little illustration here, because this is what's kind of, to me, it's fascinating, is that now you notice that when one little trait has been dissolved in that dream self, look what happens. The underlying background, the backdrop, the eternal backdrop, God, can come through. And traits of the self are dissolved. I love that idea, dissolving a trait. That's hard work, but that's what happens. Oh, what happens when more traits are dissolved? More light comes through. Now you're getting into the area where you can start to see evidence in an individual inmate's life. And it's not necessarily going to come from them. It's going to come from people that know them. They're going, that guy's different. I don't know what happened. Something's different. He seems to be a different person now. So something is going on in their lives. Can you imagine just offloading all the personality traits that are in human consciousness? I love to ponder this idea, and maybe you can ponder it too. If you were one of the disciples standing with Jesus at that very moment of ascension, what would you have thought about? Imagine standing there watching that, because it was very visible, and then he was invisible. He wasn't there. Why wasn't he there? Because there wasn't any traits that could hold him there. They were gone. He worked them out. I also think it's another important question to ask yourself is that, what would your last few moments be like before your ascension? Who are you then? What are you then? That's their goal. Mrs. Eddy said somewhere that it may require millions of life cycles to be done with mortal mind. I know my teacher on the very first day of class, he read that to us. I was shocked. And then he said, I would like to do it this time. It takes work. And that is the work. That's what we're here to do. Our transformation is their transformation. I lap your face like Arnold lapped mine. Thank you.